All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Happy Tuesday. Happy December. Happy Advent. And thank you for joining us on this, I would call it a chairman's talk, let's say, with Chairman-elect Gregory Meeks and Chairman Norbert Röttgen on transatlantic legislative priorities for the next Congress, the next term for 2021 and beyond. My name is Tyson Barker, and I'm the head of the Tech and Foreign Policy program here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. And I am delighted, because I'm also happen to be one of the in-house Americans, to be able to moderate this on-the-record discussion with Chairman-elect Meeks, Chairman Röttgen, and Daniela Schwarzer, one of our other transatlanticists in-house. Just to give a couple of ground rules, we want this discussion to be open and interactive. If you do have questions or comments, please either write them in the chat box or raise your digital hand. We would love to hear from you if you keep your questions brief. We have 1 hour. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce the speakers and then go the floor to them. So for those of you who don't know Chairman-elect Meeks, I have to say I'm really excited to have him as the next chairman, because I think he will be the most Atlanticist chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee since Tom Lantos. This guy has really invested in this relationship. He is the chair of the EU caucus. He has been the ranking member on the subcommittee for Europe in the past, and has been a member of Congress since 1998, representing New York State's 5th District. He has also served on the Financial Services Committee, and has worked on things like trade, Latin America, Russia relations, and started his first statement after winning this post by saying we need to move from America first to America forward. And I think that that's a great place to start this discussion. He's going to give us a little bit of an outline of his priorities, and then we're going to turn to Norbert Röttgen, who also, of course, needs no introduction, but I will just say that he is the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee of the German Bundestag and a member of the CDU. In fact, he is running to become the chair of the CDU, and I'm sure that that is something that we will also discuss in this conversation. And finally, to kind of give us a little bit of reflection is our own Daniela Schwarzer, as I mentioned, our transatlanticist and director of the DGAP. She has recently co-chaired a transatlantic task force, a study group, with the Harvard Kennedy School that brought out a report with Ambassador Nick Burns last week on what transatlantic relations could look like under a new, now we know, a Biden administration. And so I think that that'll give us a lot of fodder for this discussion. So with that, I'm going to start with the first question for the chairman-elect. You know, you outlined in the summer a lot of your potential priorities. Now the rubber hits the road. You are now about to take over the committee. What do you see as the broad direction for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and what issues would you like the Biden administration to take up in the transatlantic space? Chairman.
Well, look, we've got to get back to the table, first of all. So the first thing that we've got to do in the United States is to make sure that our friends and our allies in Europe know that we're going to be back, we're going to be multilateralists. Again, we're going to get back into some of the agreements that we pulled out of, like the Paris Agreement and rejoining the WHO and rejoining the JCPOA, and also, make sure that we are engaging with emerging threats. So those are items we have to restock and bring up the morale at the State Department. So we got a lot of work to do to try to make sure that we are back at the table, and individuals and our allies and our friends know that that you can rely upon us again. So we've got a credibility gap that we've got to make sure that we restore ourselves at the table, and folks know that we are going to be players, not with America first or America only, two bad public policies and not diplomatic. And we also know that we're going to talk about that diplomacy is extremely important. And we're going to also have to talk to a number of our allies who are part of NATO, that where there's human rights violations and or democracy is not prevailing, we've got to work collectively together to make sure that that they hear from us with one voice in that regard.
Well, thank you, Congressman Meeks, for that great intro. I think we got a lot to work with. We'll definitely discuss some of those issues. Chairman Röttgen, I mean, you've heard what Congressman Meeks said. We're America forward, the United States. Now we know what's going to happen. How can the German government, and particularly the Bundestag, strengthen Washington's hand, its multilateralist hand? What kind of tough choices does Germany need to make? How can this relationship become actionable again?
Mm-hmm. Okay, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this event, and I think it's the first opportunity to have a conversation with my counterpart in the House, Gregory. It's a great pleasure for me to meet you here via a Zoom meeting, and I think both of us are very much looking forward to meeting in a personal context. So I wish you all the best for your new office, and I'm absolutely sure that we will greatly work together and that we can reconnect, as you mentioned, that we can reconnect to a spirit of partnership, of cooperation based in our values of liberty, the rule of law, multilateral engagement towards the world, and that we are determined to face the challenges, the opportunities, but also the threats which are clearly lying ahead of us. So I'm very much looking forward to a close and a trustful cooperation between of us. So where are the tough choices you asked? Yes, there are some, but please allow me to start with a great opportunity, which does not really require a tough choice to be made by us, but just reap the fruits which are there. And I'm referring to international climate policy. The announcement of John Kerry, an American and international heavyweight, to become the special envoy for climate policy indicates that a transatlantic international climate policy is a real opportunity. And this would bring a new effort as a transatlantic community to the world. We can export our green technologies. We have experiences with market-oriented tools and instruments, emission trading schemes, for example, and we can bring our successes and our mechanisms and our industries towards the places in the world where CO2 emissions are still rising. So I think this is a great opportunity. I have made the argument that also Germany should establish the office and function of a special envoy with a cabinet rank. The EU could do the same, and then we would have a great setting which presents our determination to achieve real global success, not only regional success in this opportunity, in this direction. The tough choices, yes, they have to be taken from both sides. I personally assume that Germany in particular and the Europeans in general have to redefine our international role. I think it would be without any surprise that the United States could very well live with a certain kind of new division of labor. The US certainly will focus and perhaps to a certain degree will remain obsessed with China in particular and the Indo-Pacific in general. China is seen as the overwhelming, encompassing overall challenger in all terms, geopolitical, geoeconomical, technologically, and even more and more militarily, a challenger to the United States. And this means that Europe, in a way, is number 3 in the priority list of the United States. The domestic priority, then China, and then Europe. And of course, we have to define our role, which means that we have to do more for our own security. But even more, I think we have, as Europeans, to do more for the stability in our neighborhood, and both the eastern and the southern neighborhood. So this requires certainly a new role in how we understand the Europeans and Germans as partners of the United States. So to be more of a real partnership on eye level, both when it comes to forging, hopefully, a transatlantic strategy vis-à-vis China, where we have to do some discussions, I think. We do not want to have a relationship of hostility. We do not want to embrace a new bipolar world order idea, but we want to get realistic and tough, but cooperative with China. And at the same time, we have to engage more on an eye level with the Americans in Europe, in the Eastern European neighborhood, which is claimed by Russia as a zone of influence by Russia, and the full right of self-determination is denied to these countries. And then we have the Middle East and North Africa, where only the two of us can work together. We must do. It will take tough decisions, yes. It will take resources to be invested, but it is in the very core interest of our security as nations and as an alliance.
Thank you, Chairman Röttgen. Daniela, I mean, that was a pretty ambitious and useful outline of some ways that Europe can really stand up and support the United States as more internationalist, more internationally engaged United States, deepening its stake in the security in the region and broadening its strategic horizons to reach into the Indo-Pacific. What elements do you hear here that you think really could be developed really early? What kind of early wins do you think we can put on the table, aside from climate change, which I think is a really important one?
Well, I do think, first of all, if I look at the first month of 2021, from the US side, if there is a strong recommitment to NATO, the Europeans have to answer with their commitment, of course, within NATO, but then also in building the European contribution to NATO. And this is something that has been going on for a while in the European Union, and yet we are not totally there where we should be or where we could have been with regards to our capacity to act. Secondly, I think the China issue is really the key one, where Europe has moved a great deal over the past 1.5 years. We now have I would call it a strategic document that has been endorsed by the European Council, which is very realistic on what China is, and it includes the notion of a systemic competitor. However, in all details of our positioning, even within Germany, we are not fully clear where we are. And I guess one of the main concerns of the incoming US administration will indeed be to see Europe or the EU at its side in dealing with China. In some issues, it may be easier than in others. For instance, if the two sides could agree to approach anything with regards to trade in a joint way, this would strengthen our respective weight and could bring us closer to working with China on having a level playing field with China, also in the WTO, of course. And so I think here are a number of big things that should be done. But I want to pick up one of the initial ideas that Congressman Meeks mentioned, and he spoke about the credibility gap. When we wrote our transatlantic report, we thought, and this is something that applies to both sides, the essential thing to do first is really to reestablish trust. And what does this mean? It doesn't only mean trust in the transatlantic relationship, but also a kind of reinsurance what we are and what we stand for. And this is now the opportunity with the incoming Biden administration to make very clear, and again on both sides of the Atlantic, what's the normative base that we both stand on? What's the value of liberal democracy? Because that was one of the elements that this distrust was triggered by, and the credibility suffered. This is true for the US over the past 4 years, but it is also true for Europe, which is why it is one of our European priorities to tackle any doubt that may exist for the EU27 that we are not totally firm on rule of law and democracy issues within the European Union.
Well, I think that's a great place to throw this conversation back to Chairman-elect Meeks. This question of trust is such a big one in the transatlantic space. And I'm just looking at a poll from the Pew Research Center right now that say that only 26% of Germans, this was of course conducted a couple of months ago, but had a favorable opinion of the United States right now. And if we look at the kind of operationalizing of trust, a big reason why we weren't able to get TTIP done, for example, was a lack of trust in the United States, the German-American relationship, as a result of the kind of overhang from Iraq and the NSA and some other things. What can the United States and what can Congress do to rebuild this trust? Where do you think are the weak spots that could be really, really strengthened here?
Look, so, and I couldn't agree more with the chairman and Daniela on their comments, because, you know, over the last few years, I have consistently heard from our European interlocutors that what the world needs is a healthy America, a healthy American presence to help solve some of the world's most pressing problems, all of those things that were being discussed. More locally, the post-war project of a Europe whole and free and at peace is also not complete. So we've got to work to ensure that we want to be partners and a part of that and working collectively together. We are learning the lessons the hard way at home as well. You know, 2020 has been a difficult domestic scenario in the United States. Democracy doesn't travel as a one-way street. And just as the world is more interconnected than ever, we are turning inwards, and, you know, oftentimes we are blaming outsiders and others for the problems that we have. And my point is, in talking, we need each other now more than ever before. So, you know, as the outgoing chair of the EU caucus, you know, so one of the things that I think that we can do to restore that trust, and I don't mean any offense to Berlin, but I see Brussels as a necessary stop for dialogue and diplomacy in a parallel and member state engagement. And as indicated, we've got to be involved. The trust is if we re-engage with climate change, and we re-engage and make sure that we're dealing with trade and TTIP, and we re-engage in dealing with the finance, considering Brexit and a possible return to the Iran deal, as I talked about earlier, or managing Russia and China, as the chairman was talking about. This is the way that we can show that we're doing this collectively. It's not a pivot or moving to one another. I think that if we're going to deal with China, it's got to be so that we're setting the rules. You know, the United States, and the chairman got it right when you talk about, you know, China being someone that we're focusing on, but not at the exclusion of working with our European allies. To me, it's not a pivot, as some was concerned when I initially went back in 2013, talking about the Obama regime going to the pivot to Asia. It's not we can't pivot to Asia unless we're pivoting together, so that we can set the rules and and the regulations that China must follow, so that we can talk about how we deal globally in a world that is interconnected, and not look at where we did during the Cold War. So I think that's how you regain trust, by actually talking and working on all these multitude of complicated issues across, even dealing with not only China, but dealing with Russia and the democracy. But we can only do that together. So I don't see there's a pivot or anything of that nature. It is working collectively together on these major issues because we share the same values. Not saying that we're going to agree with everything, but we can talk to one another. That's what good friends and allies do when we disagree, and try to work it out so that we can have a common viewpoint, and our values are the ones that prevail.
Chairman-elect, I want to take up this issue of interconnectivity that you brought up, because I think it's really key to thinking about geopolitics today. The Congress just passed the National Defense Authorization Act, and it had two elements that are kind of focused on the German-American relationship. One, I think, that will be welcomed in Berlin, and one that will be agreed with some concern in Berlin. The first is it would require a congressional authorization or congressional review of any attempted troop withdrawal from Germany. And the second is, which was announced, of course, in the summer by the Trump administration, with no consultation to Congress and no consultation to the German allies. And the second is the broadening of sanctions, the threat of sanctions on companies engaged in the construction of Nord Stream 2. Where do you see these 2 points, and how do you think that these should be solved? Both US troop presence in Germany and the continued German-Russian energy relationship. This is for Congressman Meeks.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Chairman-elect. You have to get used to that.
I do. So look, clearly, in my estimation, the current administration and its actions that it has taken, much of it without consultation from the United States Congress, is, I think, out of line. And we will be working with the Biden administration to make sure that that kind of policy doesn't continue and we don't have that in that regard. Now, surely, as I said, we have some disagreements on Nord Stream 2 and what is the best way to go and how to move in that regards. That's important. That's where we have to have some frank dialogue in that regards to try to figure out how we're going to work together in that and to make that that's in the best interest of our European allies and in Germany, as well as in the best interest of the United States, working collectively together. But moving troops out of Germany in the manner that this current administration has talked about, to me, just does not make any sense. And I think that the Congress, and I know under my chairmanship, is something that we will be making and bringing up to the forefront and having dialogue and conversation in that regard in a very, very, very big way. I think that that there will be more consultation. There will be more involvement. There will be more, making decisions based upon facts on the ground and after we've had dialogue and conversation than just things being done at a whim without any forethought, without any looking at what the consequences are, without looking at what the relationship, what does it do to the current relationships that we have. I am sure that the Biden administration, and when I look at who the Biden administration is proposing to be in its cabinet and the long history that it has had, will make a difference in that regard. So I look forward to getting back to the table as we were. These are kinds of conversations that we were having back in 2013. And we will then get back to that type of dialogue and conversation to make a difference and to make sure that we are able to work collectively together in that regards.
Chairman Röttgen, obviously that's got to be music to your ears. That's music to the ears of Berlin, more dialogue, more discussion. But let me ask you a question. You are obviously a politician, an elected official. And as you know, politics is all about timing. And we are coming into a period where the Biden administration is going to have limited capacity because it's going to have to confirm all these cabinet appointees that Chairman-elect Meeks just mentioned. And Germany itself is about to go into a federal election. So how is it possible to deliver on all these both easy wins and more difficult wins when the honeymoon period is going to butt right up against the German federal election period?
Yeah. Yes, you are absolutely right. In terms of honeymoon and the timing of a marriage, I could imagine a better constellation than we have to face, but this is democracy, that you have to face the schedules in our in our democracies. So I think this is an important circumstance for the redevelopment of our relationship. On the one side, I would say there is and always has been a foreign policy consensus in Germany, and the transatlantic partnership is a cornerstone of the traditional, has been a cornerstone of the traditional traditional foreign policy consensus within Germany. And there are the two left and right-wing extreme parties, the Left Party and the AfD, which are not joining this consensus, but the other parties and parliamentary groups are. So that we want to reconnect, that we want to restore, that we want to shape the future on the basis of values, and of course on the basis of openness to discuss mutual interests, even if they may differ from time to time. I think this is a common ground. I have to say we have not left the common ground, and we are now looking forward to the US re-entering the common ground we have always had in our past. On the other side, yes, you are right. What I referred to in my first intervention as the new role, the new international role of Germany within Europe, within the transatlantic relationship, vis-a-vis both China and Russia, and the neighborhood responsibility. This is something which has yet to be fundamentally discussed. We must not. Well, we have to be clear about the dimension of this new international role. It would reflect a discontinuity with our role about 70 years, about decades. Nobody has asked Germany, perhaps with the exception of George Bush the Elder, to lead, to take and assume a leading role. He asked and he invited to partnership and leadership. But we did not accept this invitation because it was beyond our limits of imagination, what we could imagine that Germany could be. So it's a process of maturing, of living up to the level we have achieved in stability, in economic strength, and as an expectation level from outside to us. But what it takes in terms of money, and particularly in terms of risk. If you start doing foreign policy, you have to take a risk. And it may come at dire costs. We are not used to that. We are not used to a leading role, really not. And this has to be yet internalized. It has to be debated, and it will create two camps in Germany. There will be a camp which will certainly reject this approach as the militarization of foreign policy. They say our asset is diplomacy, is soft power, is to mediate between interests, to be in between the far left, the far right, and not to be in any way partisan in this debate. I think it's the route and direction the Social Democratic Party will take on its way to become an opposition party. And then you have the CDU, the Greens, and the Liberal Party left. And the Green Party, which is determined to become a governmental party again, has a history from becoming as a pacifist power from the left and has entered and joined the foreign policy consensus. But particularly for the Green Party as a party in government, it would be tough to take decisions, to take a much more decisive role with more resources spent for defense, for example. So it will become a big debate. The public is not really well prepared for that. And there is a great amount of reluctance, resistance, and a certain degree of angst. What may lie ahead and what we have to then swallow and to deal with. So it's one of the big debates, inevitable for us in the next decade, because it is about our future and our idea of the future.
Well, you brought up the issue of risk, and the foreign policy, meaningful foreign policy always involves risk. And with that, I want to turn it to Daniela. Before opening it to the audience, we have several questions written, but I will give preference to people who want to ask their questions verbally. So if you want to raise your blue hand and ask your question, keeping it brief, that would be obviously preferred. But Daniela, before we go to the audience, this idea of risk, and particularly in developing a strategy towards China and Russia, which Chairman Röttgen mentioned, you know, the big risk that Germany is going to be going to is the post-Merkel era. You know, Merkel has been in charge for 15 plus years. How can it formulate a new path, a more internationalist path, seizing on this idea of a partnership and leadership that Chairman Röttgen mentioned vis-a-vis Russia and China? What do you see as the specific areas that Germany can take hold of?
Well, first, let me pick up the question of risk assessment. And, you know, when we talk about Germany in that context, I would always situate it firmly in the EU and ask whether we, within Germany, have a realistic assessment of our risks and opportunities when we think about those two key countries, Russia and China, and whether we share that with our fellow Europeans. And I would say not entirely. And this is where the European Union is currently moving ahead in quite substantive terms with its outlook instrument that it is creating, as it's called, the strategic compass, which essentially serves to put everyone on the same page with regards to the risks that we are facing. Now, turning this into the transatlantic context, I think the debate on how to deal with China really still diverges quite substantively. You know, having worked with this distinguished group of American and Europeans on precisely those issues, it did turn up in several moments of our discussion to what extent the American approach is driven by the wish to actually stop China's rising to the #1 power in the world. And Europeans wouldn't fully subscribe that this is actually the goal, that their China policy serves to stop China. This is not our current debate. So that's where I think we need to be very clear and very honest to what extent we actually want to deal with those challenges together. With regards to Russia and the Eastern neighborhood that Norbert Röttgen has rightly mentioned, I believe our biggest challenge is to position ourselves on the question whether we still believe in a transition agenda and whether we are there to support those in their home countries that want to stand up for democratization and liberal democracy, or whether the EU is actually not interested to do this. And the more the US retreats from this region, I think the harder it will be for Europeans. Yeah. But it's absolutely important that there is a shared understanding of what we can achieve. And I would always argue that the Europeans shouldn't step down from their ambitions.
And that's clearly something that we see on the ground when you look at the vacuum of leadership that the US has left, and the way that smaller powers, Turkey, Russia, China, are filling in the neighborhood that they are surrounded by. We're having some questions here. I'm going to ask the first one to Congressman Meeks. It comes to us from Munich. It is, even after the election of Joe Biden, Donald Trump acts like the actual president of the USA. Is it conceivable that he and his Republican supporters will continue to organize a kind of subsidiary government on the streets in the future? That he continues with the polarization, fake news, and tries to divide the country more deeply and continue to preach isolationism? What are the Democrats and Biden going to do about it? You're muted.
I think that President Biden-elect made a terrific statement last night, indicating that we're going to move forward from this past administration. And I think that since yesterday, when the Electoral College officially acknowledged the 306 votes, Electoral College votes that President Biden has, you should see many of the members of the U.S. Senate and hopefully members of the United States House of Representatives now recognize that the President Biden is going to be the president, the 46th president of the United States of America. And that will then start to change, and that we will then abide by the Constitution. You know, what is damaging because of this question, this very question shows the damage that the current administration has done at the end of this election, because it seems as though it's what has taken place in many undemocratic countries. And so I have full confidence, though, that in the end, as we get to January 20th, that democracy will reign, that Republicans will will come and abide by the Constitution. Don't forget that in this election, this president had the opportunity to exhaust every remedy that he wanted to, not just before Democrats. It was Republican governors, Republican judges, Republican election officials who all certified and said that there was no fraud or anything wrong with the current elections. So that shows you that there are Republicans who are in prime positions that authenticate and abide by the Constitution. And I fully believe, without question, that the American people as a whole, there may be always a fringe group that will hold out and wait to the next election to try to say that there's an illegitimate president. However, we know that's not true. That will not prevail today. And we'll get back to following our Constitution and working with our good friends on the cross-Atlantic relationship.
All right, we have two questions. I see two blue hands. The first one is from Cathryn Cluver Ashbrook. She is, of course, a member of the task force and is at Harvard. Cathryn, please ask your question.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here on my American morning to meet you virtually, Chairman-elect Meeks, to see our good friend Norbert Röttgen again in this virtual format, and Daniela Schwarzer, who we have spent so much time with, working on what we think is really an important study, which I've put in the chat for all to read. And I want to pick up on a fundamental pillar, which Daniela has already mentioned, and both of you have mentioned, and then ask you for some concrete action. You've both mentioned that it's going to be critical to make the case on the transatlantic relationship to your various publics. Chairman Röttgen, you just pointed out what the debate in Germany is going to look like. And we have an incoming national security advisor in Jake Sullivan, who was a co-author of a report noting that we need to make American foreign policy for the middle class. And Chairman Meeks, you have said how important it is to retell that story and to knit those values back together, precisely because we're no longer clear about the resilience of our democracy. We hope it's still there, but as Tyson mentioned, some of the numbers seem to indicate otherwise. So to push you both a little bit on this, how do we do that dialogue? How do we bring our own publics along back to the understanding that all of us around this virtual table share, that the transatlantic relationship is essential for our common advancement, but that it is felt in every household in Germany and in the middle of the heartland of the United States? How do we do that?
Excellent question. Chairman-elect Meeks, perhaps you first, and then Chairman Röttgen.
I can tell you how we start doing that. Number one, I can tell you on the committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, we've got a great number of individuals who are from a cross section of America. Many of them come from that heartland. And what we want to do is to make sure that we don't hide from what our foreign policy is, that we in fact talk about it, that we bring it home and show them how relevant foreign policy is to our domestic policy. And I think that when you think about the issues that we were just simply talking about here, show the relevancy between climate change and what's going on and how it affects farmers because of what's happening in the United States. There's no question about greater flooding and the number of storms that we're having. Show how, if you just have no trade or not thinking about how to trade and you're just talking about how you impose restrictions on it, how that causes the cost domestically goes up substantially. Show how it affects the immigration issues that are taking place in the United States and around the world, that's all interconnected. So we can't be afraid about it. We've got to be more vocal and bring it to the attention of the American people as to how foreign policy affects domestic policy because they go hand in hand in that regards. And then how diplomacy is much cheaper than buying bullets to fight and have wars. And this is why it affects the lives, because we talk about the number of lives of young men and women who have to go to battle if we don't do that. So I have the confidence that that's the kind of dialogue that we're going to have from our leadership, from our committee, that's going to spread because we're going to look at also how to work with other committees. The Foreign Affairs Committee should be in contact and working in conjunction with the Armed Services Committee, with the Intelligence Committee, with the Ways and Means Committee. So it's all interconnected now and not separate. And we've got to bring that to the general population of the United States of America in that way.
Chairman Röttgen.
Yeah, thank you very much for these essential thoughts and outlining the linkage, the necessary linkage between doing foreign policy and making sure that you have public acceptance for what foreign policy decision entails. So I think this is extremely important. Without public acceptance, which also has always an economic dimension, we will not have the domestic precondition for doing and pursuing ambitious foreign policy goals. So what I would consider to be very important is, for this reason, to win over the public again. And not only the public, but particularly also the younger generations, younger people, because we have to legitimize the transatlantic relationship more and more through its perspective and potential for the future, and not for the good experiences which lie in the past. So it cannot be and will not be the Marshall Plan and the post-war relationship which we have enjoyed and which we have benefited so much from, which will give a sufficient basis for doing transatlantic policy in the future. So we have to look ahead and what can be done. To win over the younger generation, we should refer, and I'm sorry to be repetitive on this, the defining topic of the young people is climate change. It's the defining topic. So to try to regain legitimacy for the transatlantic course for the future, this topic simply cannot be overestimated. Because if we were to do something effectively together in this field, we would also restore the moral reputation, which has always been, perhaps in a quite naive and exaggerated, unrealistic way, an important part of our German relationship towards the United States. In a very naive way, we stick to the expectation that we want to see moral leadership by the United States. We just have to understand perhaps the German soul, and I think it's very much forged from the past and living in our time, and so we have to deliver on the moral quality of international leadership, and climate change can deliver on that. Another topic or area where we can do something together in a way which can be understood by young people is technology. They are very close to technology, and they are their digital life is very different from elder generations. And to create a great ambition would be to create a common transatlantic data space, which would also require, particularly from Germany, that we have to reconsider is our thinking and ideas of data protection compatible to the globalized development which we are facing. But then we have to ask, do we stick to our high standards but will remain ineffective because we are lacking the data, the objective for applying our rules? So I think this is a great thing. A third thing would be not just to analyze and complain about Russia's Chinese power projection, for example, with the tool of Belt and Road, but to create an attractive alternative to the Chinese model of creating dependencies, exploiting other countries, not respecting them as countries, and propose a different transatlantic, make a different transatlantic proposal, which of course has a burden because we will also talk about values, about governance and democracy, but we will be very much more benefiting for our partner countries, and we will try to enhance the economic development of these countries in a much more sustainable way. And we are not seeking dependencies but partnerships. So this, for example, would be 3 proposals which I would expect to enhance and inject a future potential and a moral quality of what we are doing and aiming at.
Those are excellent concrete policy priorities, and I think that they would resonate. I mean, I think about the debate here in Germany and the Rezo video that came out with viral last year, which really touched on the issues of tech and climate change in the German political debate. So I think you really hit the nail on the head when you're thinking about millennial priorities. We have 2 questions. 2 people want to ask questions by hand. I'm going to let them ask them both right now, and then we'll go back to Congressman Meeks and Chairman Röttgen for their remarks and final thoughts. So Philip Hirschmantel, you're first, and then Stephen Pope.
Hi, thanks. It's a question to both. I'm an analyst and a consultant working on the global energy transition, and I'm also a member of the steering group of the working expert group for energy for the Greens. So thank you both for mentioning climate change and the energy transition. I wonder, if we do all this, it will entail fundamental change, and I don't think much as we're only starting to begin to think about that. A fundamental energy transition will mean, of course, completely different flows of power and energy, and will fundamentally reshape the world as we know it. Just to give one example, South Africa and Australia will become much more alike as energy exporters, and India and Japan will become much more alike as energy importers. And at the same time, we're in a competition against China, which is dominating all critical technology related to the energy transitions. And we've lost our edge there in the past 10 years, certainly as Germany. So how do you see the transatlantic relationship re-engaging, both managing that shift in power and re-engaging a leadership position when in fact we are also competitors and have increasingly diverging interests Just think of, the import of hydrogen. Yeah, I would be very fascinated to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Okay, let's take the second question from Stephen Pope and then go back to the round.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. And my question also to both. Starting with Secretary Meeks, Secretary Röttgen, you mentioned climate change, and also a challenge for younger generation is democracy as well. And we've seen over the current year, over the recent past, a number of challenges to democracies and the principles that we've taken for granted. Now, in terms of softer diplomacy, do you think now is not the time really that Germany should be more prominent in defending the principles that we hold dear? It's still a form of soft diplomacy, but as a partner for the United States going forward, that Germany plays a much more visible role as a global broker and a representative of the democratic values that we hold so dear.
Both excellent questions. So we have a question on how can Germany and the United States, and I'll ask them both to both of you, just kind of summarizing, how can Germany and the United States maintain their edge in the green transition that's taking place? How can they regain some of the market share in innovative technologies dealing with the energy transition and climate mitigation? And the second is on democracy. How specifically, how can Germany, but I would also say, how can the United States recapture both moral authority and the political will to evangelize for robust democracies, both in Europe and around the world, in media pluralism and party pluralism, freedom of speech, clean government, anti-corruption measures, etc. So perhaps Chairman Röttgen and then Congressman Meeks, and then I will kick it over to Daniela Schwarzer for a final word.
Yes, to the aspect of energy transition, I would certainly not agree to the assertion that we have, the assessment that we have lost our edge in the technology of energy transition. It's Germany, for example, which has reduced to 40% reduced the CO2 emissions compared to 1990 levels. China has announced that it will reach the peak of CO2 emissions in 2030. China is responsible for 27% of global CO2 emissions, and they are announcing a rise during the next decade in CO2 emissions because they are not able to delink, to disconnect economic growth from rising CO2 emissions. We have managed economic growth over the last 30 years by a decline of CO2 emissions by 40%. And this is due to two components. The one is technology, and the other component is the emission trading scheme, which is a market-oriented tool which we have applied and we have to extend to different sectors, and we have to internationalize, Europeanize and internationalize. So how can we maintain the edge? By doing it, by continuing in doing and transforming our economy. Of course, the challenge is to remain competitive while integrating the ecological constraints into our current market model. In the long run, it's the only way to be economically successful. But of course, you have to design the steps in order to achieve economic progress by innovation and remain competitive. If we do this together, our power to set the rules, to internationalize the emission scheme, perhaps by avoiding a carbon tax regime. But at the end, we should be ready to do that, because we cannot afford and cannot allow other countries to be more competitive by creating a massive ecological burden for the future generations. So I think it refers to technology and international rule setting also in this case. the visibility for our for support and fight for democracy. Yes, we have different cases. Let's take Hong Kong. Let's take also Belarus, for example, and other cases where I would wish for a stronger German and European voice. And partly it has been embarrassingly absent in some ways. I think a good approach is here solidarity, unity, which we have to apply for others. And the more united we are, and if one European country starts to be vocal and clear in its language when it comes to Hong Kong and the Chinese suppression, the stronger the effect is, and the lesser the risk of being punished by China is when this country enjoys and can rely on the entire solidarity of the Europeans and the Western world. So I think it's important to perhaps come back or develop an active pro-democracy foreign policy, which will be strong if we act in a way of solidarity and mutual support.
It's quite a rousing call. Congressman Meeks, you have the final word before Daniela Schwarzer has the very final word.
So let me agree with the chairman to a large extent. We've got to change how we look at things. I believe that's extremely important. So when you talk about, for example, climate change and in working and rules and regulations, let's look at Africa, for example. It's something that we've got to put on the front burner, that we continually have on the back burner. And we can't leave the vacuum for folks just to come in there without setting rules and regulations and understanding the significance of what will take place 10, 15, 20 years from now. So instead of us looking at Africa and the countries therein as a battleground between superpowers and using the old Cold War mentality, that's completely misplaced. I think that if we work together as allies with our similar values and together, perhaps we can have investment cooperation. And we can come together to protect not only ourselves, not only do we prosper, but we're helping lift the continent up also, that does not have the infrastructure that's necessary for those same things that the chairman was talking about for millennials. That is technology, that is talking about the climate issues, that is talking about food resources, that's talking about building infrastructure, that's talking about giving technological help and infrastructure building. We can do it together as opposed to looking at it as a superpower challenge and raise those standards. And it ties right into the last question. We cannot be silent on human rights violations and where democracy is failing or losing, and we see autocratic governments coming in place. I've seen that more in the United States of America, and that's why some of the questions that you've asked is very important. Being an African American and coming from the history of America, now chairing a committee, I know how important it is for our committee to stand and have a voice for democratic values, whether it be in Europe, whether it be in Asia, whether it be in South America, or whether it be in the United States of America. We've got to have that voice. We've got to stand and talk to our allies and adversaries and speak in that voice. It is tremendously important. it is what I think is a defining point, as the chairman indicated, for millennials and people who are looking at a better world for tomorrow. For without taking care of it, you know, I grew up at a time and I listened to one of my heroes in life, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he said that in the end, it's not the actions or the words of our adversaries that we will remember, but the silence of our friends. We can't be silent when we know that human rights are being violated. He also, and I close with this, says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So if we are all silent, if we allow human rights violations to continue someplace else, like a boomerang, it'll come back to our homes to haunt us. Let's stand together and we can make a difference by utilizing and being forceful with our values.
Thank you, Congressman. Oh, please.
Chairman-elect Meeks, Chairman Röttgen, it was a huge pleasure to listen to you, and we are deeply honored that this first conversation that you are having in your respective roles, that this happens with us at DGAP. Listening to the two of you building up your vision of a renewed transatlantic relationship, which is based on morality and values, as both of you have emphasized so strongly, which would allow the transatlantic partners to reach out to the world basically based on strength and mutual commitment. If we are heading for this future, I think we would be in a very good place. Your thoughts on an agenda for the transatlantic partners, which could mobilize the next generation around climate change and technology, I think is of key importance. So let me close this session by thanking the two of you very warmly, and also Tyson Barker, who took the initiative to bring us all together for this discussion. I do hope we have a chance to revisit, but your rousing call on the transatlantic partners to stand up for the values with that morality, as you have emphasized, that is needed in the world of today. This gives us hope, and we will be watching all very closely how transatlantic relations develop. And I guess early into 2021, there will be an opportunity for German leadership and European leadership, hopefully, to meet with the incoming President Biden to deepen some of those issues. Thank you very, very much.
I would say nothing from my side to add, but just one housekeeping note. On the 14th of January, we're going to be doing an early bird breakfast. It's Deutschland in der Welt 2021, Außen- und europapolitische Prioritäten für die nächste Bundesregierung. So please come back and we will see you next year. Bye, everybody.